The sound of silence inside a courtroom is deafening. You could hear the shuffle of papers, the clicking of pens, and the sharp breaths of men and women who had been waiting months, if not years, for this very moment. Then came the words that cut through the air like a blade. 50 months. $500,000 in fines. And the instant those numbers left the judge's mouth, Sean Diddy Combs, the man once known for his untouchable swagger, his iron grip on the music industry, and his endless empire of luxury, collapsed. Literally. His knees buckled. His body gave way. The image of a mogul brought down not by his rivals, not by his industry's shifting tides, but by his own crimes, burned itself into history. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a giant fall? I mean truly fall. It's one thing when rumors swirl, when whispers haunt a man's reputation. But it's something else entirely when all of that speculation crashes down in real time, in front of flashing cameras, stunned lawyers, and a gallery filled with people who once feared him. Diddy didn't just hear his sentence. He felt it in his bones. And the collapse wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. The untouchable was suddenly exposed as fragile. The powerful was suddenly powerless. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And that, right there, is why this story matters now. Because this isn't just about one man's crimes. This is about power, control, and the silence of an industry that looked away for decades. This is about the women who spoke up, after years of being silenced by money, intimidation, and fear. This is about a cultural reckoning where heroes, icons, and moguls are being forced to face the shadows they built their empires on. But let's not rush ahead. Let's pause here, at the moment of collapse. Imagine the scene. Reporters, some of them who once wrote glowing reviews about his parties and red carpet appearances, were suddenly scrambling to capture the fall. Lawyers tried to maintain composure, but couldn't hide the shock in their eyes. Security rushed to help, but the truth is, no one could help him now. You can't protect a man from the weight of truth. And yet, here's the contradiction, the irony, even. For years, Diddy projected strength. He was the man of control. Nothing slipped past him. Everything was curated, from the women on his arm to the champagne in his glass. He controlled the narrative. He controlled the stage. But the one thing he couldn't control? The truth that finally came to light. Do you see the poetry in that? A man who choreographed the world around him now collapsing in a space where control was ripped from his hands. That courtroom didn't care about his fame, his Grammys, his billions once estimated by Forbes. In that space, he was just another defendant. Just another man facing the consequences of sick and shameful behavior. Words he himself admitted before breaking down. Now, here's where it gets even more gripping. This wasn't just a sentencing. It was a spectacle. Every word spoken that day carried weight, because every detail revealed peeled back decades of secrecy. We learned about the freak-off, parties, events that had been whispered about in gossip blogs but dismissed as wild exaggerations. But then came the testimonies. Real women, real stories, real pain. And suddenly, those whispers weren't rumors. They were evidence. Pause for a second and think about that. How many times have we brushed off the rumors about celebrities because they seem too outrageous to be true? And yet, time and again, those same rumors have a way of resurfacing. This time in courtrooms, in testimonies, in confessions that can't be ignored. So I'll ask you, how much of what we accept as gossip is really just truth waiting for its chance to be heard? That's why this story isn't just about Diddy collapsing in court. It's about the collapse of illusion. The collapse of power structures that once seemed unshakable. It's about a reckoning in real time. And here's where I'll let you in on something the mainstream headlines won't emphasize. Diddy's apology, when he finally looked at the court and admitted that his actions were sick and shameful, wasn't just a statement. It was a surrender. Because for years, he denied. For years, he covered. For years, he tried to bury stories and silence voices. That single moment of confession was the crack in the dam. And when the dam breaks, everything floods out. But let's not forget the cost of getting to that point. Women who spoke out had to endure being dismissed, disbelieved, even demonized. People close to Diddy stayed silent for fear of retaliation. And an entire industry, fueled by his money and influence, looked away until it no longer could. Doesn't that make you wonder? how many other powerful figures are still hiding behind the same walls of silence? Think about it. If one of the biggest names in music, one who literally reshaped hip-hop, who turned parties into empires, who sold millions of records and created billion-dollar brands, if he can be brought down, then who else is on the edge of collapse right now? And let's circle back to that moment in the courtroom. When he collapsed, people rushed forward. Was it concern for his health? Maybe. But it was also the instinctive reaction when you watch a man who once seemed larger than life crumble into something almost unrecognizable. That moment is burned into history not because of its drama, but because of its meaning. It was the final image of a myth undone. And yet, here's the cliffhanger. As much as that collapse felt like an ending, it wasn't. Because what followed wasn't just sentencing. It was testimony after testimony. It was revelation after revelation. It was the kind of evidence that left people staring at their screens, jaws open, wondering how this all stayed hidden for so long. The story of Sean Diddy Combs collapsing in court isn't just about a fall. It's about the layers of truth that led to that collapse. And if you think the sentencing was the most shocking part, you'd be wrong. Because what happened next, what was revealed in that courtroom, would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The gavel had barely struck when the air shifted in that courtroom. The judge's words landed like bricks. 50 months. 50. Not probation. Not a fine he could brush off. Prison time. And then the $500,000 penalty, which for most of us would be life-ruining, but for a mogul like Sean Combs was just salt in the wound. Still, it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about time. Time behind bars. Time stripped of freedom, stripped of power. Time in a space where the name Diddy meant nothing. And that's when it happened. His body swayed. His eyes seemed to glaze. The swagger that had carried him through decades of red carpets, award stages, and million-dollar parties, gone in an instant. His knees buckled, and he fell, gasping, his defense team scrambling, the bailiffs stepping in. Reporters couldn't believe what they were seeing. The mighty mogul, a man who once declared himself can't stop, won't stop, had stopped. Completely. Right there, in front of the world. Let's pause here. Ask yourself, was this collapse medical? Or was it psychological? Was it the sudden, crushing weight of accountability that his mind and body simply couldn't bear? Or was it performance, one last desperate bid for sympathy? Either way, the symbolism was impossible to miss. For years, he had been untouchable. For years, the industry called him Puff Diddy, brother love. He was the man who reinvented himself at will. But here, in a court of law, there was no reinvention. There was only reality. The empire had fallen, and its king was on the floor. Now imagine the room. Victims sat in the gallery. Women who had spent years living with shame, with silence, with scars that couldn't be erased. They watched him crumble, not on a stage with fireworks, not in a mansion with crystal glasses, but on a cold courtroom floor. What do you think went through their minds? Relief? Bitterness? Maybe even pity? Or was it satisfaction that justice, at last, was being served? Here's where the tension builds. Witnesses later said there was a moment of pure chaos, whispers, gasps, even laughter from those who couldn't help but see irony in the scene. His team rushed to help him up, but the image had already been burned into history. TMZ cameras outside caught the rush of medics entering. Social media lit up in seconds. Diddy collapsed in court became the headline of the hour. And yet, I want you to think about the contradiction. For decades, his brand was about resilience, dominance, and survival. Remember, this was the man who danced in shiny suits while his best friend Biggie's murder remained unsolved. The man who turned every setback into a new opportunity. But this time, there was no remix. No spin. No new brand name to hide behind. This was final. Let me paint you the timeline. The judge read the sentence. The words 50 months echoed. At first, Diddy's face was stoic, tight, as if he was trying to absorb the blow. His lawyers had warned him prison time was coming, but they had hoped for less. Then the fine was added. Then the explanation. This wasn't just about crimes. It was about abuse, about exploitation, about years of silencing victims. Each word from the bench wasn't just legal, it was personal. And then collapse. Now, here's a question for you. What does it mean when a man as powerful as Diddy collapses in front of the world? Is it weakness, or is it humanity finally breaking through the mask? We're fascinated by these moments because they shatter the illusion of power. They show us that even giants fall, and when they do, the noise is deafening. In that single collapse, the myth of Puff Diddy the mogul dissolved. What remained was Sean Combs, a man convicted of orchestrating crimes so dark that even his most loyal defenders couldn't explain them away. The courtroom floor became his stage, and on that stage, he didn't perform, he broke. And still, here's the twist. That collapse wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the spectacle. Because once he was helped to his seat, pale and shaken, the proceedings didn't stop. The testimonies continued. The revelations kept coming. And if you thought his fall was dramatic, wait until you hear what witnesses revealed next. The judge, unfazed, pressed on. The lawyers regrouped. And the victims finally got their moment to speak without fear of interruption. Every word they delivered landed heavier because of what had just happened. The man who once terrified them was now fragile, diminished. Their voices carried more power than his broken body. Isn't that a striking reversal? For years, his voice dominated music, fashion, business. Now, his voice was irrelevant. The courtroom belonged to those who had been silenced. That collapse shifted the balance. It was no longer about the mogul. It was about the truth. But here's where the cliffhanger comes in. Because while that collapse shocked everyone in the room, it was what happened immediately after. The testimonies, the evidence, the raw confessions, that tore down what was left of his empire. And those details, they would change everything in ways no one was prepared for. From empire to infamy. That's the arc, isn't it? A man who once embodied the pinnacle of hip-hop success, fashion dominance, and entrepreneurial swagger, now reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of a courtroom. But let's rewind for a moment, because in order to understand the collapse, we need to understand the empire. Sean Diddy Combs didn't just rise, he exploded. From humble beginnings in Harlem, he hustled his way into Uptown Records as an intern, and in what felt like a blink, he was running the place. By the early 90s, he had founded Bad Boy Entertainment, the label that would define an era. Biggie Smalls, Faith Evans, Maze, the roster was stacked, the hits relentless. Diddy wasn't just a producer. He was the architect of a sound, a style, a movement. But here's the irony. The very empire he built on resilience, flash, and charisma was always shadowed by whispers of control, ego, and ruthlessness. Fans saw the shiny suits and the champagne bottles. Insiders saw something different. A man who would do anything to maintain power. And that word, power, becomes the thread that ties his rise to his downfall. Let me ask you this. How often have we celebrated men for their ambition without questioning what it cost? Diddy wasn't just ambitious. He was relentless. Stories from the early days paint him as a workaholic, sleeping in the office, pushing artists past their limits, throwing parties that doubled as networking wars. He created an aura of invincibility. And for a long time, it worked. But think about the contradictions. The man who made I'll Be Missing You after Biggie's death turned grief into a global anthem, but was also criticized for exploiting tragedy. The mogul who built a billion-dollar lifestyle brand was rumored to exploit those closest to him. The artist who preached loyalty and brotherhood often left his protégés in the dust when they no longer served his vision. Doesn't that make you wonder? Was the empire always built on shaky ground? By the late 2000s, Diddy was everywhere. Ciroc vodka deals, fashion lines, TV appearances. His face was as recognizable as his music. He wasn't just in hip-hop. He had transcended it. But here's the darker truth. With every expansion of the empire, the need to maintain control grew fiercer. They freak off parties, the whispered abuse, the NDAs, the silencing payments. All of it was part of protecting the empire from implosion. And yet, the walls were never as strong as he believed. Think of it like a skyscraper built too quickly. From the outside, it gleams. Inside, the foundations are cracked. Every floor added puts more pressure on those cracks. Eventually, it collapses under its own weight. That's the story of Diddy's empire. Fans adored the image. Critics questioned the man. And those who lived within his circle knew the truth. Glamour often hides rot. Now imagine the juxtaposition. Just a decade ago, Forbes listed him as one of the richest men in music, on the verge of billionaire status. He posed on yachts, strutted at the Met Gala, basked in standing ovations. Today, His name is linked not with celebration, but with scandal, not with applause, but with sentencing. From empire to infamy, the transformation is complete. And here's where the cliffhanger tightens. Because while the empire's cracks had been visible for years, it wasn't until the women closest to him spoke out that the facade shattered. Their testimonies turned whispers into undeniable truth. And what they revealed next would strip the empire bare, brick by brick, until all that remained was a man on trial for the very darkness he had tried so hard to hide. They sat in the courtroom, not as pop stars, not as backup dancers, not as the women once draped in jewels and paraded through his mansions. They sat there as survivors. The women who spoke out against Sean Diddy Combs weren't anonymous rumors in the tabloids anymore. They were flesh and blood, with voices that cut through decades of silence. Think about that for a second. For years, these women were props in his empire. They were the girlfriends on his arm at award shows, the background figures in music videos, the whispers in industry gossip. He had the money. He had the power. He had the reach to make sure their stories never saw the light of day. But here, in court, the stage was theirs. The lights weren't flattering, they were harsh. And those lights illuminated truths that had been buried under contracts, fear, and intimidation. The first to speak described a world that sounded like a nightmare disguised as luxury. She spoke of freak-off parties, exclusive, secret gatherings that on the surface seemed like indulgence, but in reality were stages of coercion and control. Behind the velvet ropes and champagne flutes was a darker reality. Women pushed into situations they never consented to, pressured, manipulated, sometimes outright forced. Let me ask you this. How many times have we seen the glamorous Instagram shots, the viral clips of celebrity parties, and thought, wow, they're living the dream? But what if those dreams were cages? What if behind every polished photo was someone suffering in silence? Her words painted that picture, and you could feel the courtroom tighten as she spoke. No one shifted in their seats. Even Diddy, usually composed, stared down at the table, his face pale. Then came another voice, and another, each one different, but all sharing the same themes: fear, control, humiliation. They spoke of violence, not just physical, but psychological. Being told they were nothing without him. Being reminded that speaking out meant career suicide, or worse. One woman even said, through tears, that she felt like she had been owned, as if her life wasn't hers anymore. Do you feel the weight of those words? Owned. That's not love. That's not partnership. That's slavery in a silk dress. And here's where the contradictions tear through. To the world, Diddy was the life of the party. The man who told us to dance, who turned New Year's Eve into a cultural event, who sold us the dream of living large. But these women revealed the flip side. The nightmare he didn't want anyone to see. The nightmare they were forced to live in silence. One testimony in particular shocked even seasoned reporters. A woman described being forced to participate in encounters that left her feeling degraded and broken. She said she begged to leave, but he laughed. Think about that. The same man who once commanded arenas, reducing someone to tears in private, and dismissing their pain as entertainment. And yet, despite the horror, what stood out was their courage. Because speaking out against someone like Diddy isn't just telling your story, it's inviting the world to tear you apart. His fans, his defenders, his industry allies, they all have stakes in protecting the empire. These women knew they would be called liars, opportunists, just bitter exes. And still, they spoke. Do you realize how rare that is? How dangerous? In a culture where women are too often silenced, the fact that they sat there, in front of cameras, lawyers, and the man who once terrified them, and told their truth, that's historic. And here's what made it worse for Diddy. Their stories weren't wild, inconsistent ramblings. They were detailed. They were specific. They matched each other. Each testimony layered on top of the last, building a pattern too clear to dismiss. The image of misunderstood playboy collapsed. What emerged instead was a predator. The tension in the courtroom built with every word. You could feel it in the way the jury leaned forward, in the way the judge's face hardened, in the way Diddy's shoulders slumped lower and lower. The women weren't just speaking, they were dismantling him, piece by piece. And then came the emotional dagger. One woman turned directly toward him, her voice shaking but firm, and said, "You told me once that no one would ever believe me. Look at me now. The silence after that line was thunderous. No defense attorney could spin it. No PR team could bury it. In that moment, the empire cracked beyond repair. But here's the cliffhanger. As damning as these testimonies were, they weren't the most shocking part. Because what came next, evidence pulled from bank records, surveillance, and private communications, would prove that this wasn't just about he said, she said. It was about receipts. Cold, undeniable proof that Sean Combs had built his empire not just on music, but on control, coercion, and crimes that no apology could erase. The words "freak off" had been whispered for years. In hip-hop circles, in tabloid gossip, even in the sly jokes of late-night hosts who didn't quite have the courage or the evidence to go further. But in court, there was no rumor. There was detail. There was testimony. There was truth. Let's paint the picture. These secret parties were dressed up as the ultimate VIP experiences. Exotic mansions, expensive decor, champagne towers, designer drugs, and music pumping until dawn. To outsiders, it was fantasy, the life of excess, of privilege, of indulgence. But for those who lived it, the fantasy curdled into something darker. Witnesses described rooms where women were lined up like objects, told to entertain powerful men, pressured into doing things they didn't consent to. They were told they were lucky to be there, lucky to be chosen, lucky to be part of Diddy's world. But is that luck? Or is it manipulation wrapped in glitter and gold? Think about the psychology. You're young. You're dazzled by the lights, the stars, the celebrities brushing past you. You're promised a career boost, fame, opportunities you'd never dreamed of. And then, suddenly, you're trapped in a room where saying no isn't an option. That's not a party. That's a prison with chandeliers. One woman recounted how Diddy would hand-select who got access. The way she told it, he played puppet master, orchestrating the entire scene as if it were a production. Except this wasn't a music video. This was real life. And real lives were being destroyed. Another witness explained how phones were confiscated at the door. No cameras. No recordings. Nothing that could leak out. Doesn't that tell you something right there? If your parties are just harmless fun, why the secrecy? Why the NDAs, the intimidation, the threats? Secrecy is a shield, but only if no one talks. And here's where the contradictions roar back in. On one side, you had Diddy the mogul, throwing white parties in the Hamptons, smiling for the cameras, rubbing shoulders with presidents and billionaires. On the other, you had Diddy the predator, locking doors, pulling strings, ensuring no one left without doing exactly what he wanted. That duality is chilling. The same man who charmed the world allegedly terrorized women in private. And then came the most damning revelation: money trails. Bank records showing unexplained payments. Five-figure sums transferred quietly to women, sometimes within days of these infamous parties. Defense lawyers try to spin it as gifts. But gifts don't come with NDAs. Gifts don't silence people. Bribes do. One former bodyguard even testified, reluctantly, about what he saw. He admitted he quit because he couldn't stomach the games anymore. He described women leaving rooms in tears, stumbling, sometimes needing medical help. He admitted he was told to look the other way. That testimony sent chills through the courtroom because it came from someone who had nothing to gain, everything to lose. And here's the question for you. How many celebrities have built walls high enough to hide their sins? How many of those mansions, those private jets, those VIP rooms are really just cages disguised as privilege? We glorify the access, but maybe the access has always come at a price. Now picture the irony. These parties that were supposed to cement his legend are now the very evidence that destroyed it. The stories once told in hushed tones at industry dinners are now entered into the court record. And the women who were once props in his performance are now the narrators of his downfall. But here's the kicker. The parties were only the surface. The glamour was the distraction. Because behind the champagne glasses and luxury brands was an organized system of coercion. And the prosecution had more than just testimonies to prove it. They had documents. They had surveillance. They had undeniable proof that what happened behind closed doors wasn't just bad behavior. It was criminal. And that leads us straight into the next revelation. Because once the parties were exposed, the question became, how exactly did investigators piece it all together? Who spoke? Who leaked? And how did the prosecution turn whispers into a case airtight enough to bring a mogul to his knees? The prosecution's case was never going to be simple. Think about it. When you're going up against someone like Sean Diddy Combs, you're not just prosecuting a man. You're prosecuting an empire. An empire built on lawyers, PR teams, intimidating enforcers, and money flowing in every direction. The defense was counting on one thing: that the prosecution couldn't connect the dots, that the testimonies would sound like gossip, that the money trails would look like generosity, that the whispers of freak-off parties would dissolve into rumors. But prosecutors didn't just connect the dots. They drew a picture so clear that even Diddy's most loyal supporters couldn't unsee it. Let's break this down. First came the women. Their testimonies were consistent, detailed, and emotionally raw. But prosecutors knew testimony alone could be torn apart by defense lawyers. So they backed it up with evidence. Real evidence. Receipts, transfers, security logs. Imagine this: a series of bank statements projected on a courtroom screen. One payment for $75,000. Another for $100,000. Dates aligned perfectly with the nights of the alleged parties. The prosecution pointed out a pattern: alleged abuse, followed by sudden, unexplained gifts to women who were then bound by NDAs. Coincidence? Or hush money? Now here's where it gets even more damning. Prosecutors had phone records, text messages, emails, leaked through insiders who'd finally had enough. One message allegedly showed Diddy giving instructions about who would be allowed into these parties and what was expected of them. It wasn't vague. It was chillingly clear. And it painted him not as a man occasionally caught in excess, but as the orchestrator of an entire system. And here's a detail that stunned the courtroom: surveillance. Investigators had footage from inside and outside properties. Guests being led into secluded rooms. Staff working in silence, following orders. Women leaving visibly distressed. The defense scrambled to dismiss it, saying what you're seeing is subjective. But when the footage matched testimony word for word, the cracks in the defense widened. Now, let's talk about the prosecution's delivery. They didn't just present evidence. They told a story. They laid out a timeline starting from Diddy's earliest parties in the 90s to recent events, showing a pattern that stretched decades. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a one-off bad night. This was a lifestyle, a structure, a machine of exploitation built to serve one man's desires. And you could feel the jury reacting. Jurors leaned forward, brows furrowed, lips tight. Because evidence isn't just about facts, it's about impact. And this evidence hit like a hammer. But here's where the emotional punch came in. The prosecution didn't just show numbers and footage. They juxtaposed it with the women's voices. Imagine hearing a survivor describe a night where she begged to leave, and then seeing a bank transfer for $50,000 2 days later. That's not just data. That's damning corroboration. And yet, here's the chilling part. Prosecutors revealed that many of these payouts were labeled under vague terms like consulting, hospitality, miscellaneous expenses. Doesn't that sound eerily familiar? Like the playbook of so many powerful men who've hidden their sins under corporate jargon? The message was clear: this wasn't sloppiness. This was a cover-up, carefully constructed. But perhaps the most jaw-dropping moment came when prosecutors revealed testimony from someone inside his own circle, a former assistant who had kept journals. Yes, journals. Daily notes documenting parties, instructions, and payoffs. Pages filled with details that lined up with survivor testimonies and bank records. The courtroom gasped when those journals were read aloud. It was the kind of evidence no defense spin could erase. Think about the symbolism of that. Diddy once boasted about controlling narratives, controlling stories, controlling images. But here, his own empire left a paper trail. A paper trail so damning that it told the story better than any gossip blog ever could. And yet, here's the cliffhanger. Because while the prosecution's case was devastating, the defense wasn't ready to fold. They had one card left to play: to reframe Diddy not as a predator, but as a flawed man caught up in excess, punished for being rich, powerful, and envied. It was desperate. It was bold. And it set the stage for the courtroom clash that would either save him or bury him forever. The defense knew they were cornered. The prosecution had laid out testimony, bank trails, surveillance, even journals. The walls were closing in, and Sean Diddy Combs sat there, slumped, knowing the empire he'd built was crumbling. But defense lawyers don't give up easily, especially when the client is a man of Diddy's wealth, power, and influence. If the prosecution had painted him as a predator, the defense's strategy was to repaint him as a misunderstood icon, a flawed man. Yes, but not a criminal mastermind. And so, the performance began. The lead defense attorney stepped forward, pacing the floor with the kind of confidence only a seasoned lawyer could muster. He raised his voice, not just to the judge, not just to the jury, but to the public watching through every headline and live report. He framed Diddy as a victim of a culture that builds men up only to tear them down. This, he thundered, isn't about justice. This is about envy. This is about tearing down a black mogul who dared to dream bigger than anyone thought possible. Let's pause here. That argument is powerful. It taps into real history, real injustice, real bias. And it forced the jury to consider, is this about Diddy the man or Diddy the symbol? But here's the catch. The evidence didn't care about symbolism. It was cold. It was specific. And yet, for those few hours, the defense fought to shift the lens. They attacked the witnesses. They suggested the women were opportunists, hungry for attention and payouts. Why now, the attorney asked. Why speak up only when my client has reached the pinnacle of success? He suggested they were bitter exes, manipulated by prosecutors looking for a headline. It was a tactic as old as time. Blame the victim. Cast doubt. Twist pain into performance. But was the jury buying it? Eyewitnesses in the gallery whispered that some jurors frowned, others shifted uncomfortably. Because when you've heard voices crack under the weight of trauma, when you've seen tears on faces that carry years of silence, dismissing them as opportunists feels thin. Still, the defense wasn't done. They leaned into Diddy's empire, his charities, his music, his mentorship. They reminded the jury of the millions he donated to schools, the artists he launched, the lives he touched. Is this the legacy of a predator, they asked, or the work of a flawed but fundamentally good man? And then came Diddy's moment. The defense knew he had to speak. He had to show remorse, humanity, something that could make the jury hesitate. So he stood. His voice cracked as he admitted to mistakes. He called his actions sick and shameful. He said he was sorry. Sorry for the pain. Sorry for the damage. Sorry for what he had become. Now here's the question. Was that apology real? Or was it strategy? Because on one hand, it sounded like a confession. On the other, it was carefully timed, delivered when the evidence was stacked so high that denial was no longer possible. Some saw a broken man bearing his soul. Others saw a performer playing his final role. And the contradictions didn't stop there. Because while he admitted shame, he stopped short of admitting everything. He painted himself as a man who lost control, who indulged too much in the trappings of fame, who let temptation corrode his judgment. Notice the framing. He was reckless, but not criminal. Weak, but not predatory. That fine line was where the defense planted its flag. But here's the problem. The prosecution didn't rely on framing. They had facts. And as heartfelt as Diddy's apology may have sounded, the evidence loomed larger. Jurors weren't asked to judge his music, his philanthropy, or even his public persona. They were asked to judge the crimes. And no matter how many tears fell, no matter how eloquent the attorney's words, the evidence sat there like a mountain that couldn't be moved. Still, the defense had one last weapon: doubt. If even one juror could be convinced that the women exaggerated, that the money was just generosity, that the parties were just excess, not crime, then maybe, just maybe, they could crack the prosecution's case. And so, as closing arguments approached, the defense doubled down on that doubt. They warned of a dangerous precedent. If Sean Combs can be convicted on stories alone, who's next? They framed the trial as not just about one man, but about every celebrity, every mogul, every person of power who could one day be targeted. It was desperate. It was bold. It was emotional. But was it enough? The courtroom fell silent as the defense ended their case, leaving the image of a man, collapsing, apologizing, begging for mercy, hanging in the air. But then the judge cleared his throat, the jury prepared their notes, and the prosecution leaned forward with confidence. Because the next words spoken in that courtroom wouldn't be about performance or perception. They would be about punishment. And the sentence waiting in the judge's mouth was heavier than anything Diddy had ever faced. The courtroom was suffocatingly still. You could almost hear the sound of hearts beating. Jurors, victims, lawyers, even reporters tapping their pens nervously against their notebooks. Everyone was waiting for the one moment this entire trial had been building toward, the judge's sentence. Sean Diddy Combs sat slumped, pale, his hands clasped tightly together on the defense table. His empire was already gone, his reputation shredded. But now came the final blow, the law's answer to years of whispered rumors, sealed NDAs, and dark secrets. This wasn't about spin. This wasn't about music charts, celebrity friends, or corporate deals. This was about consequences. The judge leaned forward, his voice steady, his expression unreadable. "Sean Combs," he began, "you stand convicted of crimes that abused power, violated trust, and inflicted irreparable harm on women who deserved safety, dignity, and respect." The words carried like thunder. This wasn't a dry legal ruling. It was a moral reckoning. Think about that. For decades, Diddy had written the script. He decided who rose and who fell in the music industry. He controlled narratives with money and influence. But here, the script wasn't his. It was the judge's, and it was being read aloud in a tone that made the mogul look small. The judge acknowledged his contribution to music, yes, but then cut sharply. Good works in one hand do not erase crimes in the other. In other words, no amount of platinum records, no amount of charity donations, no amount of luxury branding could cancel out the violence, the coercion, the shame he inflicted. And then the words everyone waited for dropped. "I hereby sentence you to 50 months in federal prison and a fine of $500,000. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters scrambled to tweet the numbers. Victims in the front row held each other, some crying, some simply nodding, their faces unreadable after years of silence. For them, this wasn't victory. It was justice, cold, imperfect, but real. And then came the moment that would forever define the trial. Diddy collapsed. His body crumpled as if those numbers, 50 months, 500,000, were bricks dropped on his shoulders. His lawyers scrambled, bailiffs rushed forward, but the judge did not pause. The courtroom wasn't his to control anymore. Let me ask you this. Was that collapse pure physical shock? Or was it symbolism, his empire finally breaking him from the inside out? Was it humanity? Or was it performance, one final desperate scene from a man who had choreographed every other stage of his life? Either way, the image stuck. The empire builder on the floor, while the judge's voice echoed above him. The contrast was brutal, and the judge wasn't done. He turned to address the courtroom at large, speaking directly to the survivors. "Your courage in coming forward has not gone unheard. This sentence reflects the seriousness of what was done to you, and the law's recognition that no one, no matter how rich or famous, is above accountability." That line landed like a hammer. Because let's be honest, how many times have we seen celebrities dodge consequences? How many times have we watched the wealthy walk free while the powerless suffer? This time, the script flipped. But here's where the irony cut deep. For years, Diddy had been the man of can't stop, won't stop. His slogan was about movement, ambition, success. Now the only movement in his future would be from a cell to a yard, from a yard back to a cell. No stages, no arenas, no lights, just time, 50 months of it. The defense team tried to plead for mercy in those final minutes, suggesting the sentence was too harsh. But the judge was unmoved. He reminded them, and the world, that these weren't mistakes of passion. They were calculated abuses of power, repeated over decades. And here's the question I want you to wrestle with. Can justice ever truly match the crimes committed? 50 months isn't forever. He will walk free again. He will have money waiting, opportunities, perhaps even supporters. But reputations? They don't get parole. Empires? They don't rebuild the same. Trust? That never comes back. Still, the sentence wasn't the end. It was the trigger. Because once those words echoed across the country, the ripple effects began. The music industry buzzed with panic. Who else had secrets ready to spill? Who else had NDAs waiting to be broken? And in the silence of that courtroom, one truth became clear. This was bigger than Diddy. This was a warning shot. And just when the world thought the story had climaxed with the sentence, something unexpected happened. A voice from the industry, an insider, someone close to Diddy for years, stepped forward with revelations that even prosecutors hadn't shared. Revelations that would shake the industry to its very core. The sentence was handed down. The courtroom collapse made headlines. But the ripples didn't stop at the courthouse doors. They spread like wildfire across the entire music industry. From recording studios to boardrooms, from streaming platforms to radio stations, the shockwaves were instant and brutal. Think about it. This wasn't just any artist. Diddy Combs wasn't a side player in hip-hop. He was the architect of an era. His fingerprints were everywhere. The rise of Bad Boy Records, the careers of Biggie, Maze, Faith Evans, even his influence on fashion, liquor, and reality television. His name was woven into the DNA of modern entertainment. So when the sentence came down, the industry had no choice but to react. And those reactions revealed just how divided and terrified the world of music really was. Some artists were quick to distance themselves. Within hours, collaborators scrubbed his name from their socials. Old photos disappeared. Joint ventures suddenly paused. Streaming playlists quietly shuffled tracks out. The message was clear. Nobody wanted to go down with him. Loyalty had limits, and those limits ended the moment the word guilty echoed in a courtroom. But others stayed quiet. Their silence was deafening. Think about that. Decades of parties, favors, mentorship, money. How many careers did he touch? How many artists owed him their start? Their silence wasn't loyalty, it was fear. Fear that speaking out might open old doors. Fear that skeletons would tumble out of closets. Because if Diddy's secrets could spill after decades, who else might be next? And then there were the outspoken ones. A handful of artists and industry insiders used the moment to speak truth. One called him a monster hiding in plain sight. Another admitted, we all knew something was off, but nobody wanted to be the one to say it. Those confessions cut deep because they revealed a collective complicity. For years, the industry had turned a blind eye, reaping the benefits of his empire while ignoring the whispers of abuse. Let me ask you this. How much silence in Hollywood and music is bought with checks, deals, and promises? How many careers are built on the backs of people too scared to speak? The industry wasn't just reacting to Diddy's fall, it was reflecting on its own cracks. Labels scrambled to check contracts. Executives whispered in panic about who might be exposed next. Because if the mighty Diddy could collapse, nobody was safe. The reckoning wasn't just personal, it was systemic. And here's where it got even more dramatic. An insider stepped forward. Someone close to Diddy, someone who had been part of his circle for years, finally broke their silence. Their words shook the industry to its core. This wasn't just Diddy. This was an ecosystem. He wasn't operating alone. People knew. People enabled. People profited. Do you hear the weight in that? This wasn't just one man's sin. It was a culture of silence, of complicity, of see no evil, speak no evil. The industry that celebrated him, protected him, gave him awards, booked him for festivals. That industry now had blood on its hands. And fans? Their reactions were just as divided. Some burned merchandise, swore off his music forever, declaring that no beat, no verse, no hit was worth the stain of what he'd done. Others tried to separate the art from the artist, clinging to nostalgia, unwilling to erase the soundtrack of their youth. But can you really dance to It's All About the Benjamins when you know those Benjamins funded silence and abuse? Even radio stations debated pulling his catalog. Some did, some didn't. Streaming numbers dropped, then spiked, then dropped again as listeners wrestled with guilt and curiosity. It was messy. It was raw. It was human. But here's the most chilling part. While the world argued about legacy and loyalty, whispers of more lawsuits, more testimonies, more victims began to circulate. The industry wasn't just reacting, it was bracing. Bracing for a flood. Because if one mogul's empire could collapse overnight, who else was next? And that's the cliffhanger. Because as the industry scrambled to save face, another revelation surfaced. One message, leaked from inside prison, suggesting that Diddy wasn't done talking, that he might bring others down with him. The cost of silence is never cheap. It is bought with money, power, promises, and often, the destruction of lives. In Diddy Combs' case, that silence lasted for decades. Decades in which the music industry thrived on his beats, the fashion world flaunted his brands, and fans danced to his records, never realizing that behind the glittering curtain, there were people suffering in silence. Let's break it down. Silence was his most powerful weapon. Think of it like armor, layer after layer, protecting him from exposure. The first layer? Money. Big, fat checks written in exchange for signatures on NDAs. Some women admitted they took the money because they felt they had no other option. They weren't being rewarded. They were being paid to disappear. But money isn't healing. Money doesn't erase trauma. It just buys time, and time has a way of running out. The second layer? Intimidation. Witnesses described the way Diddy's circle would remind them of who they were up against. Nobody will believe you. You'll never work in this industry again. We'll ruin you. Imagine being young, vulnerable, maybe hoping for a career in music, and hearing those words from someone who controlled the charts. Would you speak up, or would you shrink into silence? And the third layer? Complicity. This is where the industry comes in. Executives, managers, bodyguards, assistants, they all saw pieces of the puzzle. Maybe not everything, but enough to know something was wrong. And yet they said nothing. Why? Because his success was their success. His empire lined their pockets. Silence was currency, and everyone around him was cashing in. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Silence isn't neutral. It isn't passive. Silence protects the abuser and punishes the abused. Every time someone looked the other way, every time a rumor was brushed off, every time a check was cashed instead of a voice being raised, the cost grew higher. And when the dam finally broke, that cost came due. Think about the victims. Years lost to trauma. Careers derailed. Friendships destroyed. Families torn apart. That's the human cost of silence. You can't put a dollar sign on it. You can't measure it in album sales. It lingers, invisible, but heavy, long after the parties end and the cameras stop flashing. And here's the irony. Diddy's own silence, his refusal to admit truth until the very end, became his undoing. If he had come forward years ago, if he had acknowledged even a fraction of what was whispered, maybe he could have salvaged some of his empire. But silence, once it cracks, doesn't just trickle, it floods. And that flood swept him away. Now let's zoom out. This isn't just about Sean Combs. This is about the culture of silence that still poisons the entertainment industry. How many artists, executives, directors, and moguls are still shielded by NDAs, payouts, and enablers? How many rumors are really unspoken truths waiting for their day in court? Let me ask you directly. How many times have you seen a headline, shrugged, and thought, that's just Hollywood being Hollywood? How many times have you scrolled past gossip and never questioned the pain behind it? Isn't that silence, too? Isn't society complicit every time we choose not to dig deeper? But here's the most chilling part. Silence doesn't just protect the abuser, it multiplies the abuse. Every year those women stayed quiet, more victims were added to the tally. Every time the industry chose profit over principle, the cycle continued. Every whispered warning ignored became another life, changed forever. And then came the twist no one expected. A leak. From prison. Reports emerged of a message, allegedly from Diddy himself, suggesting he wouldn't go down alone. The words were cryptic, but the implication clear. If I'm silenced, others should be exposed too. Do you see the irony? A man who thrived on silence now threatening to break it. The cost of silence had finally grown too high, and suddenly, everyone in his orbit had reason to fear. Because if he started naming names, the industry wouldn't just lose one mogul. It could unravel entirely. And that's where we leave this chapter. Silence built his empire. Silence destroyed lives. But silence, once broken, doesn't stop at one man. It spreads. And the next chapter? That's where we find out how Diddy's carefully staged apology collided with the unforgiving reality of justice, and why even his remorse couldn't save him. Sean Diddy Combs stood in the courtroom, his suit crisp, his posture tense, but his eyes betrayed him. For the first time in decades, the man who had always controlled every narrative, every headline, every red carpet, every Instagram post, was no longer in control. And in that moment, he did something he had rarely, if ever, done before. He apologized. But this wasn't a casual, PR-managed apology designed to soothe fans or investors. No, this was raw. This was unfiltered. He admitted that his actions had been sick and shameful. He acknowledged the pain he caused the women who spoke out. And he asked, genuinely, or at least convincingly, for forgiveness from the court and the public. Let's pause here. Consider the weight of those words. Diddy, a man whose life had been defined by power, charm, and dominance, was now a man admitting vulnerability. There's drama in that vulnerability, tension in that confession, and a stark contrast between the persona the world adored and the person sitting there, stripped of pretense. And yet, it wasn't simple. His apology carried contradictions. He admitted wrongdoing but framed it as a lapse, a moral failing, a momentary loss of control rather than an entrenched pattern of predation. He painted himself as a flawed man, not a criminal mastermind. That framing mattered. It was an attempt to humanize, to mitigate, to preserve some shred of the legend he had built. But the courtroom, this audience, was no ordinary crowd. They had heard the evidence. They had seen the bank records, the surveillance footage, the testimonies of women who had been coerced and silenced. His words were powerful, yes, but they were weighed against mountains of fact. Apology could not erase the trail of calculated harm, the documented evidence of coercion and abuse. Still, the moment resonated emotionally. Even hardened reporters whispered about the surreal tension. A man who had been untouchable, larger than life, now exposed, remorseful, and pleading for some form of human understanding. And you, watching from afar, are forced to ask, do we forgive the powerful when they finally admit the truth? Or do we hold them accountable for every step of the path that led to this downfall? Then came the most telling part of his apology. He acknowledged the physical harm he caused. Not just emotional manipulation, but actual violence. That admission is almost unthinkable for someone who had meticulously curated an image of charm and sophistication. For decades, Diddy had danced through headlines, collecting accolades, awards, and adoration. Now, he admitted to behavior so egregious it contradicted the very persona that had made him a mogul. And yet, there was a subtle strategy embedded in his words. By admitting to some wrongdoing but stopping short of total confession, he left room for sympathy. He was contrite, but not fully broken. Remorseful, but still capable of reinvention. It was a careful performance, and even in his collapse, a part of him was performing. Here's the irony. The apology, meant to soften the blow, may have highlighted just how high the stakes were. Because the more he admitted, the clearer it became to the court, the victims, and the public that the accusations weren't overblown. They were real. They were factual. They were devastatingly true. And the emotional beats hit hardest when he addressed the victims directly. I am sorry for the pain I caused. I cannot take it back, but I am here to accept the consequences of my actions. Those words hung in the room. They were simple, stark, unavoidable. And they marked the turning point where narrative control shifted completely from Diddy to the law and the victims. But here's the twist, the cliffhanger that leaves everyone holding their breath. Even with this apology, even with the collapse, even with the sentencing, the story wasn't over. Because Diddy's empire had left behind secrets, allies, and networks. And as prosecutors and insiders began to unravel the threads, the question became clear. Who else had been involved? Who else had known and stayed silent? And how far would the repercussions spread? Life behind bars is a reality no one who has lived in luxury ever imagines fully until they step inside. For Sean Diddy Combs, the man who had flown on private jets, slept in multi-million-dollar mansions, and dined on the finest foods, prison wasn't just a loss of freedom. It was a complete recalibration of existence. Imagine waking up not to the sunrise over a city skyline or the gentle hum of a chauffeur's car, but to the clang of metal doors and the echo of voices in a cell block. Imagine that your world, once expansive and limitless, is now measured in steps between bunk beds, a narrow yard, and the dining hall. The power he wielded outside, which once commanded respect and fear, evaporates in the face of guards, schedules, and rules that cannot be bent or bribed. The psychological toll is immense. A man used to making decisions that shaped an entire industry now finds himself dependent on schedules, rations, and the goodwill of strangers. Sleep is punctuated by alarms, movement monitored, privacy non-existent. Diddy's daily routine, once dictated by whim, now dictated by bureaucracy. The contrast is jarring and humiliating. And then there's the social dynamic inside. Prison is a world governed by hierarchy, alliances, and survival strategies. Power is measured not in money or fame, but in physical presence, reputation within the walls, and the ability to navigate unseen threats. For someone like Diddy, whose power outside was absolute, inside it is contextual, fragile, and conditional. Every interaction carries a subtext. Who can be trusted? Who is watching? Who wants to prove themselves at his expense? But there's also introspection. With days stretching into weeks and weeks into months, there's a kind of forced reflection. The man who spent decades curating his public image now confronts himself in ways impossible in the outside world. Mistakes, past behaviors, relationships, and regrets loom large. Every decision that led him here becomes a vivid mental replay. And every sleepless night magnifies the consequences of actions once hidden behind wealth and influence. Yet, the adaptation is inevitable. Diddy, like any survivor, would need to learn the rules of this new environment. He must balance visibility with caution, display confidence without arrogance, and navigate power dynamics where his fame offers neither immunity nor respect. Even the simple act of walking down a hallway or speaking to a fellow inmate carries stakes. Missteps can be costly, sometimes physically, sometimes socially. And don't underestimate the isolation. Outside, the world still knows his name. Fans, media, collaborators, they track his every move from the outside. Inside, he's removed from that feedback loop. Letters and visitors are limited. The outside life, the one that once validated him daily, becomes abstract, a world he can hear about but cannot touch. Loneliness seeps in, compounded by the understanding that time is finite and the system doesn't bend for anyone. But here's where tension builds. Life behind bars also has the potential to change a man. Some emerge hardened, some humbled, some transformed. Diddy's path remains uncertain. Will prison break him completely, leaving only regret and bitterness? Or will it forge a different kind of resilience, one born from facing absolute consequence? And just when you think the story has reached a pause, the unexpected happens. While he adjusts, messages leak from outside. Industry insiders, victims' lawyers, even former collaborators, hinting that the fallout of his conviction has only begun. The networks he built, the secrets he kept, the allies who enabled, those threads are unraveling. The empire may be physically distant, but the repercussions are immediate and relentless. Life behind bars is not just punishment. It is consequence amplified. For a man like Diddy, it is both a physical and psychological crucible. Every moment inside a cell serves as a stark reminder. Power, fame, money, they cannot shield you from accountability. And here's the cliffhanger. Just when Diddy begins to grapple with the monotony, isolation, and reality of prison, a letter arrives. A letter from someone in his inner circle. A letter containing information that could shake the music industry even further. Who sent it? What does it reveal? And could it change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, betrayal, and the empire he built? Legacy is a strange, slippery thing. For Sean Diddy Combs, it was once defined by platinum records, sold-out arenas, and an empire spanning music, fashion, and lifestyle brands. He wasn't just a mogul, he was a cultural icon. But now, that legacy is under a microscope, dissected by the court, the media, and the public. What remains when the hits are overshadowed by crimes? When the empire is tainted by scandal? When the women he exploited speak louder than the music he produced? Let's examine this. Diddy's legacy is twofold. On one hand, he transformed hip-hop. He brought artists like Biggie Smalls, Maze, and Faith Evans into the spotlight. He created an aesthetic of style, luxury, and aspiration. I'll Be Missing You became a global anthem. Bad Boy Records dominated the charts, and his influence shaped an entire generation. These are achievements that cannot be erased entirely. But on the other hand, his legacy is now intertwined with coercion, abuse, and exploitation. The court revealed decades of manipulation, parties where women were forced to participate, NDAs, and hush money. No amount of platinum records or red carpet appearances can erase the shadow those actions cast. Every hit, every business venture, every public appearance now carries an asterisk. What lies beneath? What was hidden behind the image of success? This duality raises a question for the industry and the public alike. Can art truly be separated from the artist? Can we appreciate Diddy's contributions to music while condemning his actions? Some argue yes. His influence shaped hip-hop culture in ways that are undeniable. Others say no. The abuse, the control, the crimes cannot be compartmentalized. Listening to his music now carries moral weight, a reminder of the human cost behind the empire. Even within the industry, this debate is fierce. Younger artists who grew up idolizing him struggle to reconcile the man they admired with the man revealed in court. Collaborators question whether to continue associating with him, fearing backlash. Critics ask if history will remember him for hits or for the harm he caused. The legacy is no longer just personal. It's cultural, ethical, and societal. And here's the tension. Legacy isn't static. It's constantly rewritten. One day, Diddy's music is celebrated. The next, it is scrutinized. One generation remembers the hits. Another generation remembers the harm. The court ruling doesn't just punish a man. It influences history, determining how future generations will view his contributions versus his crimes. But there's also irony. The same man who spent decades controlling his narrative, crafting an image of dominance and perfection, is now unable to control how history will remember him. The empire he built, once a symbol of invincibility, is now inseparable from the scandal, forever changing the story told about him.